All right, Daniel, let's start with how you would grade this February jobs report.
We do see that job gains are still healthy. Unemployment rate is still at a relatively low level by historical standards. But at the same time, we also know that there's a lot of uncertainty on the horizon. For example, the February jobs report doesn't really include the impacts from the federal workforce job cuts. It doesn't really incorporate the impacts from the tariff uncertainty that has really been rocking the stock market. So it's a B, but there's an asterisk.
I mean, a B is pretty good. For those who might not know the grading system for you, what is an A and what is a C?
If we had seen stronger jobs growth and the unemployment rate coming down a little bit, that would have been an A. The C would have been more of a slowdown, something that puts us closer towards a potential recession where jobs growth is slowing down, unemployment rate is increasing.
As you mentioned, we're not seeing the effects of the mass layoffs in the federal government because this was conducted, the survey, in the second week of February. Now, if we get to a C report for March, let's say, is that when Daniel starts to worry? I'm concerned when you're concerned.
Well, it's a fair question. I think that we still probably are not really going to see the full scope of the impacts from the DOGE cuts or even from the uncertainty, even in the March report, right? If workers are getting severance, if they're one of the folks who took the voluntary buyouts, they won't show up in the jobs report until they actually fall off payrolls. On top of that, there's the uncertainty that's coming from whether businesses that rely on federal contracts will actually continue to get them or will see that the same amount of money, right? And that will have downstream impacts on how many people they can hire and how many people they can employ. But there's also the tariff side of the equation as well, right? There's a lot of uncertainty about how exactly tariffs are going to be implemented, when they're going to be implemented, and that will have a pretty big impact on businesses up and down the supply chain.
Okay, so we, from your perspective, need to wait about 6 months to see the full effects of DOGE come through the numbers.
Yeah, I do think that we are going to need to wait until later in the year to see the full effect. That doesn't mean we aren't going to start to see some of the effect as early as next month's report. And certainly, I think there could be some faster impacts from the tariff side of the equation, because if businesses decide that they don't want to make those long-term commitments, they don't necessarily want to hire workers right now, that might start to show up pretty quickly, because especially with how sluggish hiring has been in the last year or two.
When you look at news reports about the jobs market, are there trends that you see in what journalists may be missing?
I think for a lot of everyday Americans, they see these headlines about the unemployment rate being pretty low, healthy job gains, a healthy job market. And I think that doesn't really jibe with how a lot of Americans feel about the job market right now. And in fact, that's something we see in our data at Glassdoor. When we look at the employee confidence index that we release on a monthly basis, that hit a record low in February, stretching back to the beginning of our data in 2016. And that really goes to show that employee sentiment is very weak, even though some of these hard economic data points point to a healthier job market. I think what's going on here is that even for folks who are still in a job that haven't been laid off, a lot of American workers feel like they're stuck in their careers. They feel like they're not making progress up the career ladder. So while they might be happy that they're still employed, that doesn't mean they're happy with the current situation that they're in the workplace. I think that's a big explanation for why employee sentiment is so weak right now, even if overall economic data is a little bit stronger.
Great point, because in retail numbers also, we have, over the past 2 years, seen a dislocation between what consumer confidence and sentiment numbers say and what the spending actually suggests. This seems like a parallel here where the job numbers seem like they're quote unquote healthy, to your point about some of these headlines, but the sentiment underlying it, the workers themselves, aren't feeling as healthy. Why is there a disconnect here?
Yeah, I think especially when we're talking about consumer spending, retail sales, we have to remember that a lot of those figures are driven by higher income Americans. They tend to make up a lion's share of that spending. So if you are one of the people who is in a higher paying job right now, is still getting promotions and raises, then the current economy might not necessarily feel that bad. But for lower income households who are still feeling the accumulated effects of inflation over the last 5 years, that the economic situation probably feels a little bit worse. And I think this is another case where, it's just important to remember, certainly as economists and commentators, like there's a difference between how we talk about the data and how Americans actually experience it. We can say inflation is almost back to 2%, but a lot of people still see that prices are higher than they were 5 years ago, and they're still feeling that in their wallets.
I mean, that's what matters, right? Is the actual time frame for the consumer that they're looking at and living by. They don't care about the nuances of month over month, year over year, like these underlying numbers. So should we be completely reframing the way that we talk about the labor market?
It's a great question. I think it's important to look at both of these things for different audiences, right? So for the Federal Reserve, as they're thinking about setting monetary policy, they need to think about what the inflation rate is. They need to think about what the unemployment rate is. And to some extent, how consumers actually feel about the job market or how they feel about inflation is maybe not as important as like the true economic data that's coming in. At the same time, that's not something that we can ignore because people are going to feel how they're going to feel. That has big impacts in the political sphere, and that can have downstream impacts on how people make decisions around spending, around their careers, about where they live, where they can buy a house. So eventually sentiment does ladder up into hard economic data. But sometimes, like what we're seeing right now, there is some dislocation.
Okay, so play journalist for me. How would you write the headline for the February jobs report?
I would say something like calm waters or calm before the storm, because I think we are still very uncertain about how the uncertainty is going to actually feed into the numbers in the coming months. And for Americans too, I think it's important to recognize that as you make financial decisions or career decisions, there is a lot of economic uncertainty. And so that might change how people approach taking risks in terms of maybe moving to a new job or going back to school or buying a new house.
I love the big picture context that you bring in, and especially using the word calm. I literally cried yesterday looking at my portfolio. As economists, you know this, and we talk about this as business news. The stock market is not the economy. Is the labor market the economy?
I mean, I'm biased as somebody who really likes looking at labor market data. So I think the labor market has ties to all parts of the economy. There obviously are some cases where those ties are a little bit weaker, but ultimately the labor market is really important for Americans to understand because obviously it is how most people spend a large portion of their days. It has a huge impact on how much people make, how much they can spend, whether on consumer goods, on housing, on vacations, right? And so again, I'm biased, but I think the job market is probably the most important place for American workers to keep an eye on.
Is it, do you think, a better reflection of what the economy is actually doing than stock market movements? If you're somebody who just wants something to hold on to understand how worried they should be and to get a sense of what's happening.
The stock market, you'll drive yourself crazy if you look at it every day.
Yes, I have.
Try to understand why things are moving the way that they're moving. To some extent, looking at the labor market data, I feel gives a much more holistic view of how the economy is doing. And it's also not quite as volatile on a day-to-day basis. My personal favorite individual indicator is the unemployment rate. It is very comparable over time. So we can see how it was 10, 20, 30 years ago and look at how that compares to where we are today. But as we've been discussing, there's definitely some nuance in there, right? Mm-hmm. Even if the unemployment rate is relatively low by historical standards, there are a lot of people who feel like the current job market isn't working for them. But it can also give us a little bit of context and say, hey, the job market we're experiencing right now, it's nowhere near, say, the 2007 recession and the housing crisis. Of course, that's not necessarily the comparison you want to have to make, but at the very least, right now, the job market is in a healthier spot, but it is also a little bit weaker than it was 2 years ago when you look at the unemployment rate. So there's a lot of information that comes from just that indicator.
That I think to have the stories told from that relative perspective will give all audiences the right framework, because we know there are people watching this who might not have been born during the Great Recession, which is just wild to me too, but that's a different story. Let's talk about the Employee Confidence Index from February. And you mentioned this, confidence levels fell to the lowest on record since Glassdoor began data back in 2016, which is almost 10 years ago. And then I was very fascinated by the confidence index by industry, because already in February, one area where you saw the steepest decline year over year was government and public administration. I've been a fan of Glassdoor data for a long time. This is where people really go to air out how they feel, their experiences. What other aspects of February's report jumped out to you?
the industry cuts, like you mentioned, were really stark. To see that drop in employee confidence in government and public administration, that also takes it down to tie restaurants and food services as the industry with the lowest employee confidence, which is not a great company to keep. We also see aerospace and defense was the industry with the second largest drop. I think a lot of that has to do with the uncertainty about how government spending will evolve. The new administration has, explicitly said they've wanted to cut defense spending. Ultimately, I think really what this data is showing us is that there's a lot of anxiety from workers right now because there's a lot of uncertainty. That uncertainty means that people are worried that they might get laid off. And actually, one thing that we're seeing as well is that even for people who have survived a round of layoffs or feel pretty secure in their jobs, they're still feeling the impacts of layoffs at their companies as well, because now they're being asked to do 2 jobs, or they're being asked to take on the responsibilities for somebody who is let go, and they're not necessarily seeing the recognition and the rewards for that, but they're also not seeing a sustainable path out of that situation, right? So I think there are a lot of workers who feel stressed and overworked, even if they themselves have not been laid off.
I know we're talking mostly quantitative for this, but I would be interested to hear if you've been looking at some of the qualitative commentary.
Yeah, so when I'm talking about those reviews that talk about layoffs, that's exactly what we did. We were looking at how people are talking about layoffs or other kind of economic terms like recession or inflation. So there has been a rise in reviews on Glassdoor that talk about layoffs. It's at its highest level since July 2020. So pretty high level of economic anxiety there. Whereas we've seen fewer people talking about inflation and recession over the last year. I think some of that is due to some of the fading salience of inflation as some of those risks shift more towards job security and layoffs. But we have seen a little bit of an uptick in the last few months in inflation and recession talk. So that's definitely something we're going to want to keep an eye on in the coming months to see if, uncertainty about the tariffs starts to increase those discussions as well.
I haven't laid the reports, the February jobs report and this employee confidence index side by side from you guys at Glassdoor. But if you were to do it, because you'd be faster at it, would we see a direct correlation or that they would match up in terms of the jobs that were lost in those sectors? Are both sort of talking and are they reflecting the same stories?
That's a good question. In some cases, yes, right? For example, we did see that federal government payrolls did actually shrink in the February jobs report in line with the drop in employee confidence we saw, but they don't always match up. And I think that's actually a good thing. Like we were discussing earlier, there are cases where sentiment is disconnected from what is going on in terms of the hard data around layoffs or hiring or that sort of thing. That disconnect points to areas where people might be feeling something that the data isn't picking up yet.
Do you think, if you're watching this, if you're listening to this, and you're also looking at the data from the confidence index from Glassdoor, the employee confidence index, and the jobs report, and you're looking at the numbers moving around by sector, that those are signals to you as the worker in those sectors to either get out or be prepared to change jobs or to look for clues of where you should be looking for jobs?
Yes, absolutely. I think it's more important than ever for job seekers and workers to be prepared and do their research as they think about career pivots or their next job or any kind of financial decision right now. So that means arming yourself with the information you need to make the best decision for yourself and your family. And one way is looking at which industries are still growing, which industries are hiring, and where there might be opportunities for growth. Another piece of advice I would give for workers is that I think a lot of people overestimate how difficult it is to switch to a new industry or switch to a new career. There's a lot of skills that are generally applicable across occupations. There are a lot of jobs in the healthcare industry, for example, that aren't necessarily frontline healthcare workers, right? So a hospital still needs IT staff, for example, or they might need administrators, right? And so those are skills that you could bring from a different industry, or there might be companies that support the healthcare industry. So a medical devices manufacturer, for example, will need marketing managers. And so you don't necessarily need to go back to nursing school, but you could look at the healthcare industry and the adjacent industries to see where those opportunities might be.
If I can make a request, because my favorite column is always the year over year column, the month over month column, I only care about if it's a really dramatic decline. But could we add like a 5-year and a 10-year too, like, eventually? Because I would love to see just how much the, let's say, growth in healthcare jobs has been over the past decade, to really give people like, listen, it's, it's not even just a year, like just look at the trends. This is where it's going. So that's my one request.
Yeah, I think that's definitely something we can look at. And I think you're
Don't do it just for
right.
me. I mean, do you think it's a good idea to have more long-term data?
Oh, I think you're totally right on this aspect. Healthcare is actually a great example because, if you look back at past recessions, COVID was really the exception rather than the rule. In past recessions, the healthcare industry actually continues to grow. You don't even really see a drop in jobs at all. So that's a sector where there really is strong resistance to kind of the business cycle.
I think there's tension right now between like the glamorous jobs still, and especially with the pressures of social media. I mean, from like a workforce trend perspective on the employee side, and then we can talk about also the employer side as well. Anecdotally, or our algorithms may tell us people have been quiet quitting for a while, that they want to start a new career as an influencer and X, Y, and Z. Do you think that workers are actually interested in the jobs where the demand is highest?
Oh, that's a great question. So I think to some extent, people are pretty flexible with in terms of the careers that they're pursuing. And when you're talking about something as big as the U.S. economy, there's always people who are graduating or going back to school and moving towards those programs where there are those opportunities. And of course, it's not trivial for folks to switch industries or to switch career tracks or that sort of thing. But you definitely see that in how like educational institutions decide where to offer programs and what programs to offer. So for example, like data science was really, really big in the 2010s. And so you saw a lot of boot camps pop up. A lot of universities start to offer like a data science major and that sort of thing. But in terms of where we're going to see that moving forward, BLS does put out an outlook for the next 10 years on which industries are going to continue to see growth. And some of the occupations that they foresee the biggest growth for are, for example, wind turbine service technicians, solar installers, some of these clean energy transition related jobs. And I think what's really great about those jobs is that they don't necessarily require a college degree, right? So those are jobs that pay pretty well, but you can still access them even if you don't necessarily have that college degree. So I think that that's an area to kind of keep an eye on.
I know exactly which report you're referring to. We'll bring you back on another show if you want to come back to talk about those. Going back to my first question, or the initial question, I mean, you know what I'm talking about. Like, you go on YouTube and it's like a day in the life of an Amazon, support engineer. And like the girl is, I mean, look, no shade to her. I mean, good for her. She's working remotely from cafes, drinking her boba tea. I'm like, I was not doing this in my 20s, Daniel. I was in the office. And so when you see stuff like that as a young person, you're like, well, why should I go and do a tougher, physically demanding job? And then the algorithms sort of reward that with views. And then, you get it into your head that I could do this. So like, that's sort of what I'm talking about in terms of like the pressures or the tensions or the influence that we have on one another as workers.
It's always a useful reminder that social media is not real life. So I do want to caution folks that it's like social media can be fun. It can expose you to new things, but you always have to take it with a bit of a grain of salt, right? That being said, there are ways that you can kind of leverage that vision or that fantasy maybe and think about new opportunities. So maybe that shows you a career path that you didn't even realize was possible, or a type of industry that you hadn't had exposure to before. And to be honest, that's just kind of a new information age way of learning about different industries and occupations. In the past, you would have had to ask your parents' friends on where they work or what jobs they do. Nowadays, you of course you can still do that, but you can also go on social media and try to find that information there. But at the same time, you do always need to take that with a grain of salt, just to make sure that you're not being sold like false promise, right?
I know, I hear what you're saying. I just wonder if people really internalize that, because to me, this is like the new version of going to the grocery store, when I was a kid, seeing like Cosmo by the cashier and have that be the aspirational thing, right, of the moment of, having a certain look or whatever. And now you're on YouTube, it's recommending you these hot videos and it's the aspirational job where you can you can drink boba and do work, which again, no shade. I mean, all power to you. My goodness. Lastly, I want to end with top-down pressures on workers in the labor force. Will the rollback of DEI policies affect the labor market in any real way for hiring and job losses? Will we see that at all in future jobs reports or employee sentiment?
It's a great question. It's the kind of thing where it's more of a slow burn problem. You're not necessarily going to see it show up in the March jobs report or the April jobs report. It's not something that'll show up in an individual jobs report. Ultimately, I think it's important to step back and think about why a lot of companies pursued these DEI initiatives in the first place, right? It was about expanding access to groups of talent that had been underrepresented in the workplace. That is an area where you can kind of see a longer term impact. For example, the unemployment rate for Black workers continues to exceed that of other groups. That's an area where we will continue to keep an eye on to see, like, is that gap shrinking or plateauing or even widening? It's the same discussion around the gender pay gap too. It's just important to step back and remember what the motivation for a lot of these DEI programs was and is, right? And also to think about like what companies can do in the future in order to continue moving those goals.
When you say to remember, who are you telling to remember?
It's important for employees to keep in mind this information and also for business leaders as well. Regardless of what programs or policies that you pick, you do have to ultimately go back to your values and principles and decide what is actually important. Because employees definitely notice when you make a decision one way or the other, and if you flip-flop on that decision. Like when we talk about marketing, for example, there's this common phrase that a brand takes years to build but can be destroyed in minutes. The same thing holds true for an employer's brand as well. Employees definitely remember the employers that stuck by them and that really made the investment in them. And they might also cast aspersions on the employers that maybe didn't really commit to them and invest in them in the long term.
I've loved having you. I hope you enjoy this conversation. Do you want to talk again in April about March? What do you want to talk? Okay, thank you. And if you do come back and you want to come back, what do you want to talk about next month? What do you think we're going to be talking about?
We'll probably still be talking about some of this uncertainty and how it's actually playing out in the economy. I think there's always also news stories about how employees are actually feeling about their workplace experience and what they're talking about. Maybe that we can leave that question open to see what employees are going to be talking about in March. And we can leave it as a cliffhanger.
Okay, I love it. Let's keep them hanging on. Daniel, it's always a pleasure. You're not only very smart, but you give me a sense of calm. And when I do these interviews, I cannot look at the stock market. So the more I do of this, the calmer that I stay. It's great to talk to you, and I'll see you next month.
Yeah, thanks.